Hello and welcome to Faith at the Frontiers, a podcast that confronts challenges to the Christian faith with hope. This is the first full episode in our series on Christian nationalism, and we're kicking off with some insights from Marietta van der Tol, an expert on the relationship between religion and politics in Europe. Marietta investigates the subtle ways that constitutions can be altered to privilege some and disadvantage others, and asks some difficult questions about how genuinely Christian the motivation for such changes can be. I hope you enjoy listening. So, Marietta, it's a really great pleasure to have you on the podcast.
Thank you so much. It's really fun to be here.
Yeah, so I don't remember when we first met, Marietta, but I think we missed each other when we lived in Cambridge at the same time, didn't we? And we actually connected in Oxford.
That's right.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But Austin, you managed to meet Marietta in Cambridge, didn't you?
That's right, yeah.
Yeah.
PhD life. It feels now, it's before COVID. It does genuinely feel like a previous life now, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. It's amazing how long ago that was and feels like a different world.
Yeah, it does. And you've recently written a very interesting book published with Cambridge University Press called Constitutional Intolerance.
That's
And
right.
as best I understand it, this sort
There
of
it is.
highlights the ways that, oh, good, very good. This highlights the ways that a national constitution can sort of codify certain forms of exclusivity, whether religious or racial or gender exclusivity. Am I understanding it correctly? Yeah.
Absolutely right. I mean, the main takeaway of the book is that intolerance finds its way into the law and often finds its way into constitutions. Sometimes that's really obvious, sometimes it's really not obvious, and it takes a bit of time to decipher the process through which that happens. But it's intolerance is often sort of associated with sort of what we did before we had constitutions or before there were modern states, before there were nations. But actually, intolerance is of all ages, and I think the question is, how do you moderate that as a society? Because it's a reality that we cannot deny.
Yeah, very, very interesting. And we'll dig into some of these terms. I mean, in this podcast, we're most interested in the religious dimension of that, so we're going to focus on that. But before we dive in and think about Christian nationalism, could you just give a few examples of how intolerance can be embedded in an institution, so we have an idea of the kind of thing you're talking about?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So in the book, I don't really talk about America, although some of the examples could very well resonate with American audiences. The cases that I discuss here are Hungary, Poland, the Netherlands, and France. And what you see in each of these places is that there is some sense of what the nation is. Sometimes that's kind of Christian, sometimes that's not necessarily Christian, but in all cases it kind of construes the self and the other. And the question is then what happens with the other in the Constitution? When we talk about the we in the Constitution, does that include minorities? Or if we talk about religious freedom, whose religious freedom are we talking about? Do some groups get more religious freedom than maybe other groups? Or are some groups targeted in particular because, you know, those who are in power aren't too happy with them, or their position is socially slightly awkward? It can be for all sorts of reasons. But the Constitution is kind of a distribution, as it were, of the freedoms that people have. And we like to say that's for everyone, and it's the same for everyone. But in practice, this is not always the case.
I see. So it's about perhaps religious freedom not always being the same for everybody. Can you give one example from one of those four countries where you see that religious freedom not being distributed equally?
Oh, absolutely. So, you know, Hungary is one of these countries that presents itself as sort of Christian nationalist in one way or another. I don't know, maybe some people have heard of Viktor Orban before, and Hungary as sort of this beacon of Christianity in Europe.
The Prime Minister of Hungary. I was told off severely for calling him the President of Hungary once.
Yeah, no, maybe he would like to be that in the future. I don't know. But yeah, so he's the Prime Minister of Hungary. And when he came to power in the early 2010s, there was a complete overhaul of the constitution. Like, if you think you are living through a constitutional crisis right now, like in Hungary, this happened also quite quickly. So the constitutional court's powers were rolled back. The new constitution was written. But the other thing that they did was write an entirely new church law. And in this church law, it kind of said which churches could even call itself still a church, and which ones just had to be some sort of foundation or charity or religious organization of another kind, but weren't in the law understood as church. And the way that Hungary did this was by rolling back the legal status of a church. So imagine if you are maybe an elder or something in a church, if you enter a contract, you do that on behalf of the church, not on behalf of your own individual. And that's exactly what's at stake. So if you roll back that legal status, suddenly people have to enter into contracts on a personal level rather than on an institutional level. So actually quite a lot is at stake. And what you see in Hungary is that some churches had no problem with getting the legal status back, and other churches have really struggled with this and had to go to the Constitutional Court, had to go to the European Court of Human Rights, and even after the European Court of Human Rights said, you can't just roll back the legal status of a church, then, the conclusion was, well, then maybe we should change the constitution. So it's this kind of constantly finding a way to disadvantage certain communities. And the church that has been most severely compromised by this is the Hungarian Evangelical Fellowship. And because of all the things that have happened, they've basically been pushed to the brink of bankruptcy. It's really quite relentless. And it just so happens to be that the leader of this church is an important figure of the opposition. Surprise, surprise. So I think this is really an important example of this.
Well, that's very interesting. It puts some flesh on it. This is an example of intolerance between different kinds of Christian, right? One kind of Christian taking dominance and pushing out other forms of Christianity within a state that's quite happy to call itself Christian nationalist, it seems. Is that right?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So what makes this nationalist? I can sort of see why it's intolerant and why it's exclusive and why the Constitution is driving that, but what makes it nationalist?
Yeah, so this is really a question that is a different answer for each of these countries. In the case of Hungary, there is a very clear sense that Hungary is a Christian country. In practice, it's almost as secular as the Netherlands. So again, it's a difference of the theory and the reality. But what you see here is that the story of who the we are in this constitution is really ambiguous. So it talks about Hungarian nationhood, but isn't entirely clear if this is talking about ethnic Hungarians wherever they live in the world, if it is ethnic Hungarians in Hungary and just over the border in other countries like in Ukraine or in Romania or in Serbia, or if it's talking about all those who have Hungarian citizenship. And this ambiguity means that when you talk about the nation in a constitution, so the Hungarian constitution will talk about, for example, a system of national cooperation. Who's part of that story of the nation? It's not clear. So it's really, that's maybe not really a clear answer. But when you look at France or the Netherlands, you see much less defined sort of sense of Christianity in the idea of nation, especially in the Netherlands, where I'm from originally. It's a pretty secular country. It's not that there's no Christians, but these communities live as one of the many groups in the Dutch society. And when you ask, what does it mean to be Dutch? People give different answers. But in the cases that I was studying, people would single out Muslims and say, well, they don't really ascribe to Dutch values, or they don't really ascribe to liberalism or to gender equality. All these sorts of topics that we now sort of think as defining of Dutch nationhood, but that sort of come with an assumption of who the we are, but also an assumption about who the they are. And of course, there's lots of Muslims who are also liberal, also care about gender equality. And, so you cannot really make that distinction. But if politically people drive that sort of difference, it becomes really hard to talk about a sense of nationhood that's inclusive of people. It's not even migrants, it's people who have lived there for generations, who are Muslim and who want to continue practicing that to some extent. Not everyone is like that, of course, there's lots of difference. But we're not talking about some sort of foreign religion. We're talking about people who were born and have grown up in the Netherlands and who are also Muslim.
And who are perfectly happy to conform to the law of the Netherlands and that kind of thing, I suppose.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's so interesting that, these discussions of nationalism, it seems like an easy term to use because nation states are everywhere. But when you get down to it, right, it's these kind of fundamental questions of identity, and are we thinking about beliefs? Are we thinking about values? Are we thinking about right political systems? And I think that we see so much at stake in how people imagine what it means to be part of their nation state, and so it's not just about like the borders you see on a map, but these really really complex questions. And I appreciate that. I think you've always sort of pushed me to think about not just how these sort of live as ideas in communities, but how are they kind of codified in law in these sorts of places. I think the connection between that is really illuminating and just fascinating how different that looks in countries that otherwise we might think are quite similar.
So in what way?
I think it's
sorry.
really worth. Sorry, I think it's really worth also saying here that the codification can look different. So it might be that you have an actual amendment of a constitution. Those are really difficult to sort out. Hungary gets it done quickly because there's a two-thirds majority in parliament, but this is highly unusual. Other states will mostly opt for slightly different interpretations of concepts that are already in the constitution and just say maybe it means something slightly differently, or will interpret it differently. Trump, for example, also sort of made some references to interpreting the American constitution differently. This is really one of these tools that is used quite frequently. So it's not always dramatic. I think that's important to notice, and it's not always one act. It can also be really a process of sort of mainstreaming a completely different meaning. Exactly. Yeah.
So in what sense would you see Christianity as motivating or driving some of these constitutional changes?
That's a really, really good question. I don't think that's necessarily obvious in all cases. As I said, Hungary and the Netherlands are both examples of pretty secular states. And I think Christianity is often a useful ally. But if really Christianity is what motivates these changes, that's a different question. It might be, or it might be for some people. But in practice, we find that movements that are existing along sort of the radical right spectrum is that they try to appeal to a Christian audience. They will use Christian symbols. They will use Christian rhetoric. It all feels kind of familiar if you're a churchgoer. But then when you drill down to what they're actually saying, that may or may not be grounded in Christian doctrine or Christian lifestyle, is sort of the pew sitter might understand it. And it often kind of boils down to sort of simplistic arguments of, are you for or against homosexuality, or are you for or against abortion? And while those are important questions, and of course they need to have some sort of answer, that's not the entire story of Christianity. And it's often the rest of the story that kind of, does kind of gets conveniently ignored.
I did a bit of reading about Viktor Orban's use of Christianity, for the book that I'm writing on immigration. And I find that he talks a lot about, we're a Christian country, or Europe is a Christian continent, and we need to preserve Christian values or uphold Christian values. But one of the things I noticed was that he almost never talks about what those Christian values are. It's just a sort of this vague category that allows me to kick out Muslims, basically, or keep Muslims out of Europe, without saying, well, what are these Christian values? I guess you probably know more than me about this, but I would guess one of those values would be the preservation of traditional family, perhaps. But one of those values is certainly not the welcome of immigrants.
Clearly, yeah. I mean, the other thing is that, when you look at levels of corruption in this country, they are through the roof. And, it's really, it's public money that goes into the pockets of private actors and gets barely sort of accounted for. And it's kind of easy to distract our attention by talking about all these sort of high stakes culture war topics. But I often see that as a red flag to distract the people from what they might then not pay attention to. So I think that's really an important part of this. I think the other sort of benefit of talking in a really vague way around Christian values is that lots of people can sort of interpret for themselves what that means to them. So it allows lots of different people to rally around that sort of rally cry. But the more specific you get, the more people you're going to lose. So there is a real strategic value in keeping these concepts quite vague. But I think, again, for the pew sitter, you might ask some questions about how Christian all of this business actually is. And I think, to be honest, there will be, this is the flip side of this, because the churches have been such a useful prop for the government and are sort of locally the most visible representatives almost of the government. There's so many public services that have been sort of redelegated through the church organizations. For ordinary people, the reckoning will come when Orban is gone, but when these churches are still there. So I think it will come back as a boomerang in the face of these churches. And that's, sort of long-term, I think the tragedy of churches that have, after communism, seen an opportunity to reassert themselves in public space, but actually, if it's not really supported by the broader population, or it ceases at some point to be supported by the broader population, the question of what their position is locally and nationally will obviously be asked.
You want to? I'll jump in then, Austin. Could we move to talk a bit about Poland, because I don't, maybe you can correct me, but it seems to me that Poland has a lot higher level of church attendance. People call it one of the most Christian countries in Europe in terms of church attendance. So is Poland a bit of a different case where Christianity is a bit more genuinely at the forefront of the politics there, or is it just the same?
That's a really hard question to answer. My impression is certainly that there is a higher percentage of people identifying with the church compared to Hungary or the Netherlands, and certainly France, of course. But at the same time, also in Poland, the Catholic Church is also divided over the question how far to go in the support for the Law and Justice Party. And I think what we see internationally is the face of a Polish radical right that identifies with the church, and some, right-leaning conservative Catholics who will identify with law and justice. But that's not the entire picture. There's lots of tensions within Polish society about the dominance of the church. And even within the church, I was in the monastery of Jasna Gora in January. This is a fantastic, monastery with a beautiful old icon, very much a symbol in sort of common understanding of Polish identity, of what it means to be Polish. And at the same time, the week before I was there, the new right-wing candidate went there to sort of announce his new campaign. And the monks are at absolute pains to say, nobody can claim who we are. We are here for everyone. So that was a really interesting sort of plot. I wasn't expecting this at all, but there was a lot of, outrage over the fact that a politician would go to this holy place and claim this space as sort of his. And it was actually quite good to see that, the monks weren't having it.
So there is some pushback.
Yeah.
What they're objecting to is that this Law and Justice Party in Poland is claiming to represent the true Christians, or even the true Catholics in this case. But there's a lot of Catholics who say, no, this isn't really representing us. This isn't what Christianity stands for, and this isn't what Catholicism stands for. Is that right?
I think that is part of it, but it's also an understanding that the mission of the church is a different one to the mission of these political parties. So it's also, maybe some of these monks identify with law and justice, but it doesn't mean that as a holy space, this monastery is there to be claimed by one party or another. And they find it really important. When I walked in into the monastery, the first question I was asked is, are you Catholic? And I sort of said, well, no, because I grew up Calvinist, so not quite. And then, the monk said to me, oh, it's so good that you came because, the Holy Mother is for everyone. And it was a really sweit moment where I wasn't expecting to hear this.
It wasn't sort of border control asking you if you were Catholic.
No, not at all. I wonder
good.
if
That's a relief.
The tour was different because of it. But yeah, it was really, really sweet, actually.
Oh.
Yeah, this is, I think, often I think in the, these kinds of debates that are happening in society, many people are sort of approaching them within Christian spaces as which of these political movements is the Christian one.
Hmm.
And I think there's so much to be said for just the general, the stance that those monks took, which is there's no such thing as a political movement that's the Christian one, right? That the kingdom of God is not, right? This is, I mean, the whole Christian tradition is this constant refrain of where the kingdom of God is not the kingdom of man or the city of man, right? There's a distinction here, and we might have reason to support certain political movements or ideas, but that's always going to be somewhat distinct. And sort of like one of those big questions of Christian nationalism is just how much is this about essentially conflating those two things.
So to what extent can you identify one particular political party's agenda with the kingdom of God and Christianity in its totality? Mm-hmm. I think we want to be careful to say that we're not saying that you should withdraw from politics, right? Mm-hmm. That Christians just shouldn't vote for any particular political party because none of them really have anything of Christianity in them. But what we're saying is if you identify them so completely, like many people are saying evangelicals have done with the Republican Party in America, then you end up with a situation where the political party might be shaping the faith rather than the other way around.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it becomes very difficult, right? So in a lot of these churches, that question that you were saying of how much is it actually Christian beliefs driving these versus just like secular politicians using the stories and symbols of Christianity for their own ends. Christians lose the ability to discern between those two things, right? And that I think is a thing that we're seeing in a lot of these contexts is just if Christianity on the ground is built on one of these political platforms, right? Then it's sort of custom built from the ground up to be used by secular political parties for their own ends, and no one's gonna be able to say anything about whether or not that's really fitting to the kind of Christian views.
I think that's right. And to be honest, when you look at this question, you can ask yourself, if a politician didn't need you for the vote, would they still say the same?
Mm-hmm.
Or would they say something else?
Very interesting question.
Yeah.
Yeah. Are they just appealing to get your vote? I had Alex Faludi on this podcast a long time ago, like almost 2 years ago now, to talk a little bit about Hungary and Viktor Orban from a perspective of immigration policy. He was quite insistent that Viktor Orban himself was appeared to be a genuine Christian. His faith appeared to be real. It wasn't just a political strategy. And he said that's different from what you might see in France or Germany or other places. He thinks that Viktor Orban really does find motivation in his faith for what he believes. It's just that what he understands his faith to be is not quite what we would understand to be the priorities for Christianity. Would you want to weigh in on that? I know you know Alex as well.
Yeah, I mean, he makes a very valid point in that it's not for us to sort of judge how Christian these leaders are as individuals. What we can judge is their political action and their political rhetoric and say, what is this expressing? What are the interests that it represents? What are sort of the political calculations that are made? And I think what I sort of enjoyed as part of the process of writing the book was sort of wrestling with this question because, I grew up in a Christian community and there were very clear sort of parameters for what it meant to be Christian, right? If you fell out of that was very clear locally. And what I find so striking about the current political moment is that those local boundaries seem to be completely different compared to the boundaries that are drawn nationally. What does it mean to be part of us? And often, I sometimes say, especially in the American context, there's so many different churches that would not take communion together because of all sorts of good reasons, but they will protest on the street for the same reason, or they will vote for the same political candidate. And it's not, that is of course not the same as sort of entering into communion together, but it is a good reminder that sometimes our discernment of what we think, what it means, who we are, is different on a national level. So I find that interesting. So I wrote for each of the chapters, I put a quote at the start, kind of to give a little bit of a flavor of what the chapter is about. And I think what I did in the case of Hungary was a quote from John Locke, so not necessarily a theologian, but
interesting.
Like somebody known for his political theory. And well, what he says is this. It's kind of old English, so I apologize, but he says this. Whosoever will list himself under the banner of Christ must in the first place and above all things make war upon his own lusts and vices. It is in vain for any man to usurp the name of Christian without holiness of life, purity of manners, benignity, and meekness of spirit. And I just find that a really beautiful picture, not so much to say who is Christian and who is not, but to sort of think what are sort of the thresholds that we hold this to. And
It's very interesting coming from a political philosopher, a very, very well-known and influential political philosopher as well, that he says, look, your politics isn't Christian if your character isn't showing these various virtues. That's very, very interesting. I didn't know that John Locke said that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And it is, I mean, in the US, obviously, this is, think about, so evangelicals in an uproar about Clinton saying that very thing over and over and over and over, right? This man doesn't have virtue. He shouldn't be president. And then, the fascinating thing with Trump was how quickly they completely turned 180 and said virtue doesn't matter, character doesn't matter. That's completely irrelevant to politics. And everybody was, and I think it's just interesting how that can happen, right? And how quickly those boundaries, as you're saying, that sense of like, people are Christian, and if they're Christian, their lives look like something particular, but politics has this way of sort of subverting that, at least in this current moment, and saying, actually, right, those boundaries, which, for a few decades were sort of everything, they crumble in a moment, and now we have different boundaries, which are about something completely different. And how, I mean, we've spoken quite a bit on this podcast in various ways about how that, I think, is redrawing the maps of what those communities look like and who identifies with them, right? Because now the sense of even of religious communities of who are we, right, is because of the politics has shifted quite radically, and so quite a lot of people, right, we had a whole series on evangelicalism, which is partly about a bunch of people that now found themselves not fitting this new kind of set of boundary markers for what counts as Christian, right, because it's centered around a particular political vision now, which I think is just so interesting.
Yeah, I mean, just to respond to that briefly, like I studied in America for 2 years, from 2014 to 2016. So this was just before Trump was elected in 2016. And I think what I remember from this time is a sort of gradual awkwardness around church life, where people could go to church, but, to some extent, voting for different parties. Of course, there were churches that were sort of predominantly Democratic or predominantly Republican. But it's really like one of the more painful things I've seen is just churches falling apart, friendships falling apart over something that is not actually so locally embedded, but apparently something that was national and far away from each of our daily experience was big enough to drive a wedge in all that bound us together locally. Yeah. I find that just really, really sad. I just find myself reflecting on like, how can we tell each other the story of Christianity if we are, even in our own lives, unable to engage with people we disagree with? That's before you talk about constitutional intolerance, with this being sort of, expressed at a national level or constitutional level, but it begins locally with an ability to, negotiate those differences in daily life.
Yeah. I think that's so significant. And I wonder, is something similar happened in places like Hungary or Poland? I mean, it hasn't been the same kind of political things, but have you seen a sort of redrawing of local kind of boundaries and communities as a result of these things as well?
That's a really good question. When I think of the case of Hungary, I think what I've seen is that if you are not supporting Viktor Orban's party, it's really difficult to function in the churches. So I heard, a woman who was leading Bible studies being told that because she wasn't supporting Viktor Orban, she probably shouldn't be leading Bible studies. And So that's a story I've heard. I've also heard stories of pastors fearing to lose their job if they spoke out publicly against Viktor Orban. And also just in the leadership, there is a real hesitance to speak out, if certain things happen in government that are, not quite aligned to the stated doctrines of the church. It's really difficult because the opposition has been pushed out of so many public spaces, and that includes the churches. This is not in any way sort of unique, but I think Hungary in this respect has gone through this process for much longer. But the sort of, you have the exclusion that comes from pushing other people out. but you also have exclusion that comes from making the we really big and important and significant, and then there's not much space left for everyone else. So that's also a dynamic, and I think that's what we've seen in the Hungarian case. But I think in lots of churches, this is hotly debated. Like, you have some Christians who will see an opportunity and leaning movements and parties to maybe realize some of the values that they care about. But this is always a contested question in churches as well. So even in the Netherlands, where I'm from originally, like, you have this sort of almost awkwardness in the churches to talk about the radical right, even though some people are quite keen to say there should be boundaries. But it's kind of socially not so convenient to do that. So people rely on other people, like maybe public intellectuals or journalists, to sort of make revelations, and then people can talk about, maybe another corrupt thing that happened, fine. But it's really difficult for a pastor to say, or even in the church context, where the boundary is. And it makes me think of other contexts in the world where politics has been challenging. Like, it is hard for churches to speak out. It can come at a huge cost. But at the same time, if you're completely unwilling to speak out, then what is your witness? You may as well close your doors, right?
Well, it gets so much aligned with whatever the political agenda is that it loses its own distinctive voice. That's kind of what you're saying, isn't it? Would you call that
Absolutely.
an instance of Christian nationalism, or would you call that a result of Christian nationalism in some way?
I think it is both. Or it can be both. I think it really depends on the context. I think, for some Christians, the far right had been around for a while before they jumped on the bandwagon and thought this was useful to them. But you also had Christians who were engaged from the beginning. And then you had the Christians who were engaged for a while and became disillusioned because they realized that these radical right parties weren't actually so interested in their Christian faith. So I think it is a process through which people go differently, but you always see some sort of movement. It's not like there is a stable sort of support or lack of support. I think that is really, well, some people, of course, will offer stable support, but most people are just trying to express their dissent or their resentment at the way the politics has gone. And they might find for a while some support for that voice in the radical right. And I think what we need to do is take really seriously what that resentment is, without saying that the method through which this is expressed is the right one, because I think it is problematic.
Right. Listening or like taking seriously that anger and that sense of dislocation that led to the rise of far right party. Do you mind if I dig a little bit deeper on the whole idea of nationalism? I'm just interested to hear how you're defining the term. What's that term? How are you using the term nationalist in your book and in your discourse?
Yeah. So in my book, I kind of don't really talk about nationalism as much as about national identity.
Okay.
And the starting point for me is very much what constitutions may or may not say about this, what legislative processes say about this. So that might be a law proposal, or it might be the motivation for the law proposal. That's sort of my starting point. So it is quite, like, the positionality of that definition is very specific. It's
Right,
not to say
okay.
this is all that one can say about nationalism. Of course, there is an enormous literature on nationalism that will say, well, some forms of nationalism are sort of grounded in values, others are grounded in ethnicity. I think that's a slightly sort of outdated way of looking at nationalism. I think it can take many forms, and it comes usually with some sort of articulation of an other that's either external to the country or internal to the country. So external might be migrants, or it might be a foreign power. Internal might be your political opponents. So the way that people started talking about the enemy within, like this language of, it's not just like was the other, but also the sense of threat that is implied in that articulation of otherness. I think that's really important to understanding nationalism.
Yeah, and you wrote an article called Transnational Christian Nationalism. Is that right? Am I remembering that title correctly? So you were pointing to ways in which nationalism can actually be sort of translated across different national contexts. Is that right?
That's absolutely right. I mean, I would say that these nationalisms don't ever look the same from one country to another, but they build on roughly sort of overlapping discourses. And the discourse of gender is really useful for this. The discourse on migration is really useful for this. The discourse on sort of Christian values, or in Europe, Christian Europe, or Judeo-Christian Europe, depending on who you're talking to, those are really important frames that are being used. But in each context, that meaning will be different. So, the Netherlands has a strong right, radical right presence in politics, but this form of nationalism cannot really afford to be so anti-gay, for example, because they would price themselves out of the market in the Netherlands if they would do that. That's not going to appeal. So the topics that are chosen, I think, are very much related to where the electoral opportunities are. And for some, that might be in gender. For some, that might be more in migration. For some, it might be more about sort of an anti-EU discourse, for example, or even anti-NATO, depending on where you are. That discourse seems to have gone rather quiet in the last couple of years, because it turns out security is important after all. But I think it's important to see that this nationalism is very much pivoting towards where the electoral opportunities and also risks are. So, who are you alienating and who are you attracting? And I think what the populists have done well in the last few cycles of elections is understanding where those opportunities might be. So that's also to say, it's not only that these nationalisms look differently, but they also tend to have slightly different aims. And that's also important, because it becomes really obvious in the current moment that, if you're in Poland, you will be worried about Russia. If you're in the Baltic states, you will be worried about Russia, maybe even more so than in Poland. Like, this is, for some of these nations, this is also about their sense of survival and the chance that they will have at survival should Russia, give some invasion another go in another part of Europe. So I think what has really come out of the woodwork is that we've seen sort of pro-Russian sentiments in some of these movements, and it's always hard to sort of say who is talking to whom exactly. You get in trouble immediately if you try to say a word about this. But the point is that we have seen radical right movements that are sounding more pro-Russian, and those who have suddenly stopped sounding slightly pro-Russian, and then you have those who were never pro-Russian. So that is, I think, a really important thing to notice, because in the current geopolitical moment, there is, enormous questions about the future of NATO, the future of the West, the future of Europe, the future of America, as what was understood to be the leader of the world and the leader of the West. So how that all fits together it really depends on how you look at the international relations of the region. And I think the question of Ukraine is really paramount here. You will see that those who tend to be more pro-Russian will say things like, well, should we support Ukraine militarily, or should we do something different? So Hungary, for example, didn't allow any military equipment to be transported to the country. Said, oh, maybe we'll do some humanitarian support. That we can do. Poland, on the other hand, has been really quite strong on the anti-Russian, or I should rephrase that really. Poland has been quite strong in its response to Russia for historical reasons, obviously. And then you have people further west in Europe realizing that they need to build some sort of European defense system should NATO sort of lose its fundaments because of political fallout. And then there is America that doesn't seem to know what its current role is and is still sort of figuring out what that might look like. But it's not obvious that it will really want to give up. So, yeah, it might, but we don't know.
And what role is Christianity playing in these decisions, or in these choices to be supportive of Russia or against Russia, or supportive of Ukraine or against Ukraine?
No, that's the $1 million question. I think it's really not obvious. And I think what has been really painful for some of the Ukrainian Christians, whether Catholic or Protestant or Orthodox, but especially among Protestant, Baptist, as well as Presbyterian, is that many of their missions were funded by American churches at some point, and this is why Russia regards them as complete enemies. If you go, well, you don't go, but if you were to go to the occupied territories, you will find that churches are completely driven on the ground, persecuted, that people are tortured, that people disappear. The situation is really, really dire. And for Ukrainian Christians, they look to the West and particularly to churches in America for their moral support. But those same churches are now divided over the question whether or not to support the current presidency, whether or not to support Ukraine militarily, and they feel it as a form of abandonment. It's really it's painful to see, and you wonder by yourself, like somebody like G.D. Vance goes to Religious Freedom Summit and says, we should take seriously really which countries do and do not treat religious freedom properly. He said in slightly different words. Yeah, look it up if but he talks about that, but then he's also not that supportive of Ukraine. And we've all seen what happened in the Oval Office, whatever that was. It was embarrassing for America more than anyone else. And yeah, I think it is difficult for Ukrainians to build on sort of the support in the current moment. They care about their religious freedom. They don't want to come under Russian rule. It might mean the death of quite a few of them. So, this is it. I think it's difficult to come to terms with that. A group that was so clearly an ally is when they are in power, not so clearly an ally anymore.
Yeah, I think it's so fascinating. This is something I constantly am just so surprised that, Christians, how often they're not thinking about like Christians in the areas where the kind of geopolitical questions are at stake. Right, it's irrelevant to them. Sort of what's happening to Christians there. It's rather these broader alignments with their political views and what they're making of that. It's such a it's kind of a bizarre thing, but I think it is really telling of this moment of how these kinds of allegiances and frameworks are stacking up, and which ones are sort of taking priority. So it becomes very difficult to say, as you said, like what's the role of Christianity here, or like that word almost starts to be meaningless, right?
I think what I found really encouraging is, when the full-scale invasion happened now 3 years ago, I think the churches in Ukraine were very quick to set themselves up as humanitarian hubs. And it turns out that when you're close to suffering, the church can figure out what it needs to do. That's sort of, I think, really encouraging. Not sort of, that's actually really encouraging. And I think what we might need to understand better is how the distance creates also sort of an empathy gap when it comes to these issues. So, it's easier for us to sort of think, well, the war has been going on for some years, but is there a way forward now? What is the way forward if America and Europe are not able to deliver the level of support required to really push back on Russia? Or maybe they're able, but for all sorts of reasons not quite willing to go the full way. There's all sorts of reasons why the current why we are where we are currently are. But it is discouraging, and I think it should give us some reason to pause and reflect on what is it that we think Christianity is doing in these politics, and at least recognize, whichever way one votes, recognize that this is a really messy picture, and it's not so easy to say there is one righteous way and there is one righteous way, because both are complex and riddled with contradiction.
Yeah, I wonder, thinking about questions of sort of tolerance and intolerance, and part of what you were talking about was making me think about often I think liberalism and nationalism are in constant tension, and maybe particular forms of nationalism are really in tension with liberalism. So this kind of question of is there something about this moment in which like a lot of Christians in these spaces have sort of lost their reason to be invested in the liberal project? Is there something going on with these forms of nationalism that are pulling them away from there? Because more kind of constitutionally centered visions of nationalism would be like we're a liberal state, and the point of that is kind of constitutional freedoms. That's our identity, and the more that you pull your identity in other ways, then the more that gets sort of shifted about freedoms for some. I wonder if you could just talk a bit about those concepts.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is where we start in my course on democratic backsliding and resilience that I'm now teaching at Cambridge. And, people mush together liberalism, anti-liberalism, illiberalism, basically all the time, but we're talking about slightly different things. And I think this is actually helpful in sort of orienting how Christians might look at democracy. Because what you find is that, if you look at liberalism as a ideology or as a sort of ism, lots of Christians might say, well, there's some things that we disagree with. And there's some Christians who will say, well, I just really do not subscribe to the sort of liberal project. But that's on the level of sort of ideology.
Yeah.
Now, when you talk about politics, we talk about a constitutional democracy. We don't really talk about liberal democracy, although that's what everyone is saying now. And it kind of makes it easy to say, well, if you're not supporting liberalism, then why should you support liberal democracy? But actually, what you might say is, you might not identify as a liberal, but it doesn't mean that you've written off your democracy. And I think that's really important because in the current moment, we see that radical right movements are capitalizing on Christian support to tear down some of the constitutional structures that have offered mutual protection to different groups in society. And I think this is something that is really underestimated as a problem, because the moment that you make the Constitution about sort of the will of the majority, you lose the sense of commonality or the sense of we and the sense of mutual protection and dignity that we ascribe to each other and that we say we uphold.
Yeah, that's right. The government doesn't just look after the majority. The government looks after everybody, including the minority who didn't vote for them and who look different. I guess that's the point you're making, right? Well, the government's supposed to do that.
No, absolutely.
Yeah. I remember, Tobias Kramer, who we also had on this podcast and who you also know, Marietta, talked to me about the inherent tension in the idea of liberal democracy, because actually liberalism and democracy can sometimes be put at odds with each other, because liberalism wants to include everybody, but democracy can sometimes lead to a situation where one of my friends once said, 4 wolves and 3 sheep vote about what to have for dinner. And democracy can actually end up preying on the minority, right? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. But I think this is very much inherent to how we understand democracy. If we understand democracy as the vehicle to gather the majority of votes and therefore we dictate what our politics are like, or if we look at democracy as a way of negotiating the different interests and coming at some form of compromise that might hurt different groups at different times throughout the constitutional sort of period. And I think we lose that sort of sense of compromise if we make it sort of, in the Song of ABBA, like the winner takes it all, the loser has to fall. Like this is where we have arrived, and it's not sustainable. Like, I was doing some research into how people went about this before we had a constitution, and the whole point was that people thought constitution was a good idea because it was one such mechanism to protect different groups, the interests of different groups. So I think we have to go back to that sense of constitutionalism rather than necessarily liberalism as such, because it's one of these concepts that can mean anything to anyone. And just as an anecdote, like where I am from in Holland, we talk about liberalism very differently to liberalism in America. So one takes liberalism as sort of the left, but the other version of liberalism associates conservatism with liberalism. So it's also deeply contextual what we're talking about.
Liberalism has in fact changed, especially in America, because the classical liberalism is actually perhaps more aligned with sort of libertarian capitalism and therefore with the Republican right than with the Democratic left. So as you're right, what do you mean by being liberal? What are you setting free?
Yeah. And are you as invested in someone else's freedom as you are in your own? It's a really basic question. Like, it's not so different from the sort of mandate to love your neighbor as much as yourself. Like, it's give your neighbor as much freedom as you want for yourself. And if you don't want to give it to the other, maybe you shouldn't have it, or maybe you should wish it for you both. I don't know. But it is also a disposition. It's not just law. It's a disposition as well.
Yeah.
And I think, constitutional democracy, I think, as a way of framing it is helpful because you recognize that even what liberalism is doing today is essentially mediating competing political philosophies, many of which are not very liberal, right? And so it is still saying you have special interest groups who have ways of thinking about politics, but they're doing that in a sphere that is sort of governed by constitutional democracy, often thought of in terms of liberalism, and that still is an important layer for all these kind of different ways of, because the thing that classical liberalism doesn't do is it doesn't really give us resources to determine the goods that we should seek for human flourishing, right? It's just a way of keeping us sort of from stepping on each other's toes, and so that question of like, how do these kind of competing groups come to sort of reason together about their good, but then sort of seek each other's ability to do that in different ways. I think we're just seeing increasingly a kind of breakdown in anyone being interested in other people having that, that ability.
Yeah, exactly. Having a thicker idea of what it is the common good that we're actually pursuing, rather than just, any individual can pursue whatever good they like as long as they're not violently laying hands on anybody else.
It's also the mirroring effect. So if you in the current moment happen to be the ones with power in your hand, and you think, this is a good moment to centralize and concentrate power in our hands. What if power switches hands?
Yeah.
Like, what if this power could be used against you? Would you still be so comfortable with what you're doing in the present moment?
Yeah, be careful what allies you're making, because they won't always be your allies.
Well, that too.
Yeah.
But I think the more important thing is, from a constitutional perspective, is, if you allow the rights of others to be hollowed out to the point as they are, and I think in the American context, it's something that we have to be increasingly wary of. What does this look like when the tables turn? And would Christians then, feel so happy, or would they feel even more sort of, pushed out? I don't know. I think it's an important way of looking at this, because it can hold up a mirror to you and say, well, if the other had this in their hands, would you be happy? And if you wouldn't be, why are you comfortable letting democracy slip?
It's a very, very critical question, and a bit of a scary question, really, because it gets at the whole root of what you should be using power for, and what you're depending on as your security and as your vehicle for bringing the kingdom of God. Are you depending on political power to do that? Because if you are, what happens if it changes hands and all of that centralized authority turns against you? Yeah. Thank you for listening to Faith at the Frontiers, a podcast that confronts challenges to the Christian faith with hope. If you liked this episode, then do subscribe to hear more like it in the future. For now, goodbye.